Hey guys, 3 years ago now I made a video diving into the history of the original Steam machine and how it's pretty much one of the biggest failures Valve had ever seen as a company. I do recommend watching that video before this one, but a quick recap is that this thing is a piece of crap. It was crap 11 years ago, and it's even more so today. When I did my video 3 years ago, I found out a lot of the history that people don't really talk about when it comes to this thing. I found people who had prototypes, and Valve originally was trying to sell many things as Steam machines from different hardware vendors. The Steam machine wasn't really a specific thing, it was more of a hardware line, an idea. A lot of them didn't come to fruition, and I'm pretty sure the only ones that actually sold anything were, well, these things. Alienware Steam machines. If you were born before 2015 and heard anything about gaming PCs at the time, you probably heard about Alienware. And if you're a normal person looking to buy one of these things, you went to the Steam page, saw Alienware, and, well, the rest was history. So Valve was offering different pre-builds, and if one of the pre-builds was the iconic name Alienware, well, it's the only one that sold. And if I'm honest, it was really bad hardware. Not because it didn't play games or anything, but because this thing is practically a high-end laptop. If you didn't know, Alienware is actually considered to be a pretty dogshit brand by anyone who knows computers. Overly expensive pre-builds with horrible proprietary cases that have horrible airflow and upgradability, typically filled with Dell bloatware, and whatever other upsells they try to get you to sign up for. But as you can see, this thing is tiny, compact, and surprisingly, it's got a pretty good CPU. Hearing what I said about Alienware, you heard overly expensive, but you didn't hear that it ran badly. And, well, you'd be correct. Even back in the day, yeah, they might have been expensive, far more expensive than a similarly self-built PC would be. They definitely worked. They ran the games you'd want for the most part. So what's the problem with this one? Well, there's two things. One, it was running Linux in 2015. Linux was not really ready for the mainstream gaming people would have bought this for in 2015. And two, this thing is running a laptop graphics processor. Nowadays, ironically, starting around 2016, 2017, just about a year after this thing came out, laptop hardware got insanely good. They're still not as good as the full desktop graphics cards that they share their names with, but if you got a laptop with a 4060 in it, comparing it to the desktop version, it's not that bad. It doesn't run as well, but that's a sacrifice you make for portability. Back in 2015 though, laptop graphics processors were considered separate things entirely. They didn't share names with their desktop counterparts and they were typically pretty bad. The graphics processor, or GPU to make this easier going forward, in this thing is an 860M. If you go online and look for a desktop equivalent to this thing, a lot of the people will say the 750, maybe the 750 Ti, but any amount of proper research will find that this thing doesn't hit anywhere near those numbers. Anywhere from about half to about 70% of the performance of those cards is what you're typically going to get with this thing. And well, I lied, because there's actually a third thing holding this back. This was an NVIDIA GPU being sold to run Linux. I wish I could say Linux doesn't like NVIDIA, but it's more like NVIDIA doesn't like Linux. Their driver support on Linux, while better lately, is still severely lacking. But today's support doesn't really matter when I'm using hardware from Obama's second term, and that's partially why I wanted to cover this thing again. When I covered it 3 years ago, my Linux knowledge was incredibly surface level and new. 2 years of messing around with SteamOS on the Steam Deck helped me at the time, but I still kept it to a minimum. I know a bit more about Linux now, and how I could have improved what I did, and where my research was lacking. So, let's take another look at the original Steam machine 11 years after its release. So first things first, we're going to run some tests on Windows. To get a baseline, this is pretty much the best compatibility where we'll get little to no issues. Older games like Half-Life 2 and Metroid 2033 will obviously run with no issue. These boot up and run like butter. 2033, not as much. This game's original PC release runs well for how good it looks, but we're still playing at normal settings here. Anything higher and it drops below 60. But considering it mostly runs above 60 at normal settings, it shows that this hardware for 2015 was mostly competent, at least on Windows. Moving up a few years to games that released around 2015, like Yakuza 0, Metal Gear Solid 5 Ground Zeroes, and A Hat in Time, all these work without issue. MGS5 was almost completely maxed out, running at a near locked 60 for the entire opening cutscene, but I had to drop some settings to medium for gameplay, but then it was locked at 60, no problem. This game was always extremely well optimized. Another well optimized game is Yakuza 0. Considering it's like MGS5, a PS3 game widely known for its PS4 port, it runs like butter on most hardware. Not much to say here, it runs at 60 FPS with almost no drops. So I decided to throw in a game that was always questionable with its performance. Despite only coming out in 2017 and sporting a cartoony art style, A Hat in Time has always run weirdly poor on lower end hardware. I used to struggle to play this game at 60 back in the day on a 960 and an i5 4460, and it seems like this game still struggles on low-end hardware. Even turning down the settings, I couldn't get it to lock to 60. I had to drop the resolution to 720p, and it still had stutters and freezes. Not really a complete fault of the hardware, it's why I tried this game knowing that it couldn't brute force this game despite being pretty simple visually. Great game, but playing this game on this hardware, even back when this game came out, was for some reason taxing compared to an open world sandbox like MGS5. Moving on to 2018, Monster Hunter World does boot and it does run, but Monster Hunter World wasn't the best running game on PC at launch, and I'd argue it's still not a well-running game now. But now that we have better hardware, we can ignore it for the most part by just brute forcing it. And well, it really shows because playing it on low looks ugly and you can't hit 60 frames for shit. This game uses a variable resolution setting, and turning it off and like capping the 30 is just the best bet. If you ask me, this is definitely the way to go. I didn't get much more in-depth footage of this game because to change a lot of the settings you need to go back to the main menu and restart the game, but 30 FPS is playable, bit ugly, but you can definitely do some hunting on this. So after World, I thought it'd be only appropriate to skip a couple years and do Rise. Rise originally being a Switch game and far newer, it should run better, but newer games run the risk of not supporting such old hardware. Thankfully, Rise runs just fine. You can definitely make some sacrifices to hit 60, but despite that game being a Switch game and having worse quote-unquote fidelity than World, I think your best bet is to make it look better than the Switch and cap it to 30. In my experience, Rise is a very weird game on PC. It'll run at 30, 60, no problem. But running it at anything higher than that requires like very high PC components for some reason. I had a 3070 and a Ryzen 3700X before, and I couldn't lock to 120 FPS no matter what I did. Only after upgrading to a 9800X 3D was I able to get a lock to my monitor's refresh rate of 165. So seeing it not hit 60, even with some concessions, doesn't surprise me one bit. You can always go further, but it'd probably not be enough to lock it. So I tried to keep it mostly fair with these newer games, an indie game named Haste, and the new Katamari game. Katamari, nothing surprising here. It looks like the PS2 game, but there's a lot of objects and physics and stuff going on here. It has performance drops below 60, but the fact that this runs at all, I'm not complaining. It's not exactly a game where I even noticed the performance drops either. I just had a good time playing this again for the video. Haste, on the other hand, I'm surprised that this one ran as well as it did, but it still didn't run as well as I had hoped. I tried to be generous using such an artistically simple game like this one. Bright colors, soft round character models, just in general something you'd think that would run on hardware like this, but I still couldn't lock it to 60 for 1080p. But in the actual running sections, it actually did stay around 60 where it mattered, but it would have a dip or two. Games like this keep old hardware alive while still looking great, but I did have to lower settings to get this performance. And well, before we swap over to Linux, I have two games I tested that didn't run well at all. Helldivers 2 and Rivals of Aether 2. Helldivers 2 I never thought would run, but I thought I'd give it a chance. There's a chance that I could have done some digging to get this running on old hardware, and I get it to run at some horrible graphic settings, but I think it's good enough just leaving it where it is, although this one, I'm definitely confused by. Rivals of Aether 2 by all means visually looks like it should run, but it didn't boot. I tried a little bit, but I wasn't about to waste my time to see why Rivals of Aether 2 wasn't running on the Steam machine. It's probably just Unreal Engine 5, probably some weird workaround to get it working, but Unreal Engine 5 is just not worth the work for this video. I've got Linux to tackle. I'm not going to throw whatever incompatibility this is on top of it. So here's a quick Linux introduction and my choices. I chose Fedora. I've been running Fedora on my main PC for about 7 months now, and it's what I'm most familiar with. It's got good documentation, good community support, and good gaming support. Where I messed up last time was thinking that Linux would just choose what worked best. Typically they do that, but what I didn't really understand was how this applies to NVIDIA. Turns out, NVIDIA drivers on Linux don't really care if they actually are designed for your hardware or not. It kind of just defaults to the latest in most cases. Latest usually not being something you always want on decade-old hardware. So my first attempt at fixing my previous mistakes was to find drivers for Kepler GPUs. Kepler being the architectural generation that this 860M GPU is made on. Thankfully, there's people who have documented this for Fedora as I presumed, and I was able to do some terminal nonsense and the GPU driver changing to get this done. And testing games? Well, it didn't work. If anything, I somehow got even worse results than last time. The only game I could really get to run was Dying Light. Even MGS5 wasn't booting. I wasn't sure what I did wrong here, so I threw in the towel on this installation, ran it back, and just ran with the drivers Fedora gave me out of the box. This also didn't work. So I did some more digging, found out that there's a specific version of Proton that exists specifically to help Kepler GPUs, and well, it kind of helped. Dying Light still doesn't even work after going back to the old drivers. Proton Seric was able to get Dark Souls Remastered to boot, but at 1 frame a second? I couldn't fix this. I didn't even know what was wrong. At this point, it's kind of getting hard to care. So I decided one last Hail Mary, a game that this hardware should be able to run, Resident Evil 2. So I decided to revert to the old Kepler drivers again and Proton Seric, and I was finally able to get it working. It doesn't run perfectly. It's running worse than it probably does on Windows, but judging by the videos I found on YouTube of this running on 860Ms, it's pretty damn close to how it would run on Windows, and that's good enough for me. I could try and put more games onto this and get it to run more things on Linux, but if I'm honest, it's just not worth the time. The old drivers and Proton Seric didn't work for most games I tried for it, and I think it's time to just throw in the towel. It's not because I don't want to, but it's because the hardware just isn't designed for this. Not only is using an NVIDIA GPU as old as this on Linux just a lot of extra work, it's inconsistent and honestly extremely time consuming. Not to mention that for some reason, this thing only allows me to download at 10 megabytes a second. Sometimes. Because sometimes it downloads at 100, and I have no clue why. Restarting the computer will occasionally just choose whether or not this thing downloads at a snail's pace or blazingly fast. And sadly, most of the time, it's snail's pace. Downloading enough games to take up the 512 gigabytes of space I put in this thing at 10 megabytes a second is enough to take up most of the day. Sometimes it just doesn't even turn it off when I tell it to. This is a known problem with these Alienware mini PCs at the time. You have to hold the button down to actually get it to turn off, like you're smothering it with a pillow. And just in general, you'd be better off putting Windows on this thing and using it for emulation or something. To make this a little more interesting, I actually built a computer specifically for this video with somewhat time-appropriate hardware. Like I said before, the CPU in the Steam Machine is actually pretty good for what it is. It's an i7-4785T. It was never holding the 860M back 99 out of 100 times. This CPU is just far ahead of the GPU, so to get something similar, I went with a Ryzen 3700X and an RX 480. The Ryzen is obviously way more powerful and way more recent than the RX 480, with it releasing in 2019 against the 480's 2016 release date. But the reason I did this is because I really want to show you what it would have been like graphically if the Steam Machine just had a normal graphics card in it. The RX 480 4GB model is still an extremely good graphics card, especially for the prices you can find it at today. It wasn't top of the line in 2016, performing about on par with Nvidia's GTX 970, a card that released 2 years prior, which was the same year the 860M released. So I'm not giving it any sort of unfair advantage outside of it being the 8GB model, which desperately helps it in modern games. Right now, I have a GTX 980 in here, which I also did some testing with, but chose not to include in the video, as it has 4GB of VRAM and therefore underperforms in modern games because it can't load everything comfortably into the VRAM. So with the CPU and RAM constraints out of the way, the RX 480 out of the gates is running Pragmata at a frame rate comfortable enough to lock this game at 30 FPS in the most taxing area in the game, New York. Pragmata so far is my game of the year, and seeing it run on decade-old hardware this smoothly, you can play the entire game like this, for sure. I didn't even bother trying to boot this on the Steam Machine. I knew I'd have the worst headache trying to get this to run. But this is a brand new release, starting up and running with literally no problems on a normal computer graphics card from 2016. Now, if you ask me, I don't like FSR 3. A lot of hardware YouTubers for some reason like to test low-end hardware and use FSR 3 despite having better options, making the game look absolutely horrible in attempts to get games to run at 60 FPS. But there's no need to get this game running at 60 if you ask me. But I'll try anyways. And I just used the resolution scale to drop it to 50% and it looks way better than FSR 3. And you know what? It runs at 60 FPS. It's blurry, sure, but if you wanted to play like this, you could. But 30 FPS with the controller at native 1080p, it looks and plays great. The CPU was hardly being used at all either, so I'm confident that there's a decent chance that if the Steam Machine were to simply have a better graphics card or something from AMD, we'd at least be able to boot this up and run it at 30. Next up is the tried and true Resident Evil 2 remake as a benchmark. And at medium settings, 1080p, we're getting an easy, nearly consistent 100 frames a second. The game averages above 80 frames a second, and that's far more than enough. On the Steam Machine, I had to lower the resolution to 720p to even get above 30 FPS consistently and on lower graphics settings. Capcom's games always run absurdly well for what they look like, so I decided to push my luck and boot up Helldivers 2. And well, it boots. I can't say much past that though, because it turns my computer off. Like no blue screen, no error, nothing. It just turns off. I have no clue why it did this, and honestly, it's not important to me to find out. It was able to boot Helldivers 2, and that's farther than the Steam machine ever got, and I'll consider that a win in the PC's book. I'm sure I could have figured it out and got it playable at like 30 FPS, but the amount of work to just see this game run in a mission just wasn't my priority. So if Helldivers 2 could boot, why not try Rivals of Aether 2? And by God, did it boot. I could even play it. I had a weird bug where it wasn't running well after a reboot, and lowering some settings, it was running at above 60 FPS without a single hitch. And for the finale, I tried Haste again, and of course, it ran like butter, running at frame rates I'd argue don't need to be explained. It's over 100 FPS at all times. 11 years later, we're just at such a different place with hardware and software that the circumstances this thing released in not only don't matter anymore, they practically don't exist either. Linux is just way better, the hardware has obviously improved, and mobile gaming architecture has reached heights never thought possible. I'm able to run Dying Light on a phone processor. Like, this is phone hardware in the shape of a 3DS. It's easier to play PC games on this thing than the Steam machine sometimes. Hardware ages, becoming obsolete and unsupported. It's still kind of a shame that this hardware came out at the time it did, with Valve trying to push Linux. It was just the wrong time, and judging by how it runs games on Windows, it wasn't completely horrible. Most of the games run actually insanely well because the CPU in this is a desktop CPU, and a pretty high-end one, but it's ultimately held back by the 860M in there. It was a good laptop GPU by 2014 and 2015 standards, but extremely lacking by desktop GPU standards, and a laptop GPU was never going to hold its own in the PC market for long, with the Pascal architecture coming out in 2016 and redefining how good a laptop GPU could be. The Pascal architecture has some of the most iconic graphics cards in gaming, being the 10 series, so by the time this thing came out, there was about a 1-year timer put on it before it became essentially irrelevant hardware. So that's the original Steam machine. Just as much of a failure today as it was back then. But my feelings on it since my first look at it 3 years ago have softened. It's still garbage, don't get me wrong, but considering how well it runs on Windows, being able to stop caring about getting it to run on Linux and accept it for what it is, a 2015 laptop GPU with a PC CPU, it doesn't do half bad. This thing has almost no value to me beyond the fact that I own a part of PC history here. I often forget I have it, leaving it in a corner of my room to collect dust. I saw a video recently calling this thing ahead of its time, but I believe that to be really disingenuous. It was just a PC at the end of the day, and a very bad value, poorly supported, and a bad performing one at that. I think today, with what I've shown you of its best possible outcome performance on Windows, you can clearly see that this thing would have never succeeded in its time. The reason the new Steam machine will most likely be successful, and the current Steam Deck is successful, is because they are products of several years of preemptive work to get them into the place that they are today. The original Steam machine's hardware wasn't all that great for its time, and the software it originally launched with was distinctly a product of its time. Maybe it was ahead of the average Linux build in 2015, but even then, just a few months later, the efforts of Valve would somehow just be integrated into the average Linux build anyways. The new Steam machine will just blow this one out of the water. It wouldn't be hard to cross the very low bar the original has set, though it is a little sad that they share the same name. I know I made a video on it, documenting it and its history, but naming it the same thing will probably lead to the original one's information being lost to history outside of videos like this and the people who knew about it. Oh well. This thing sucked anyways.